we want to spend just a moment at this point talking about what our book labels evidence for evolution. And so these are reasons that when most scientists, these are reasons that explain why, when most scientists look at the natural world, they conclude that evolution is the reason that we have the diversity that we see today. Now, not all scientists, but the majority of scientists do look at the natural world and conclude that evolution is the underlying cause, the origin of biodiversity that we see today. So we're going to start with anatomical similarities between organisms. And so when we look at organisms, we see a certain amount of similarity as we compare one organism to another. For instance, here we have the forelimbs shown on our screen from a human, a chimpanzee, a lion, a sea lion, and a bat. And as we look across these forelimbs, then in every case we see a similar bone pattern. And you may realize that in your arm you have a humerus, you have a radius and ulna that I'm pointing to here on the lower right hand side of our screen. You have carpals, which are your wrist bones, metacarpals, which are your hand bones, and phalanges, which are your finger bones. If we look at a chimpanzee, not surprisingly, we see a remarkably similar conformation. We see all those same bones. It may be a little surprising to know that when we look at a lion, we also see those same bones. When we look at a sea lion, which has flippers and instead of arms, we see the same pattern of bones. We see a humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, and even a bat. You see plenty of bats flying around in the evenings these days as summer approaches. And we see the same bones in a bat, the humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And so scientists are always interested in the simplest explanation for an observation. And most scientists conclude that the simplest observation for the origin of this similar bone pattern that we see in all these organisms is that at one point there was a common ancestor, and that common ancestor gave rise to the different mammals that we see listed on the screen. And so anatomical similarities are one point that we're going to list as an evidence, point of evidence for evolution. Another evidence of evolution is something that we refer to as vestigial traits. Vestigial traits are traits that are present in an organism but are not utilized by that organism. And so your book lists wings in ostrich as an example. So ostriches really don't need wings, they don't fly, but they have those wings, and presumably they have those wings because they arose from an ancestor that had wings and could actually fly. And so as we look across different animals, we see these vestigial traits, and the vestigial traits seem to provide us with some clue of the ancestors of that particular animal. And so when we look at a snake, for a certain group of snakes, for instance, pythons, we see that pythons have vestigial legs. They have these very small bones associated with their pelvic girdle that are similar to legs, but are not legs. They're not used by those organisms today, and so those are vestigial traits. So vestigial traits seem to provide us some insight into the origin of a particular animal by telling us something about the ancestors of that organism. A third evidence for evolution that we're going to look at are shared developmental pathways. And so interestingly, when we look at the embryonic development of various organisms, we see a lot of similarities. And so here we have a snake, chicken, possum, cat, bat, and a human. And what we notice is that the embryonic states of these organisms look quite similar. So for instance, the human, at one point in development, the human has gill slits, and the human actually has a what's called a post-anal tail, an actual tail. Now those characteristics go away in the fully formed human. As you've noticed, you don't have a tail or gill slits, but again, that seems to indicate most scientists agree that provides some insight into the evolutionary history of that organism. In other words, the ancestors of that organism had those characteristics, even though the organism today does not have those characteristics. Another aspect, another evidence point that serves as evidence for evolution are similarities in DNA. And so, when scientists were first classifying organisms, classifications were completed entirely based on phenotype, entirely based on the appearance of the organism. And what we see today is, interestingly, that in most cases, the similarities in appearance reflect the similarities in DNA sequence. Now, in some cases, we were wrong, and so those organisms are being reclassified based on the DNA evidence. But the idea is well illustrated in this diagram on our screen. Here we have a common ancestor, and this is the family tree for this group of birds that we see here. At this point, there was a split, and one group of organisms went this way, evolutionarily speaking, and one group went that way. And so if we compare all of the DNA sequences to this particular bird, then what we see is, of course, this one would be 100%. This bird's 90% like this one, 90% similar. This one's 90% similar to this one. The red knot is 90% similar to the ruddy turnstone, and the Caspian tern is 72% similar to the ruddy turnstone. And that's consistent then with what we see in this would be the result of this phylogenetic tree. The split here occurs first, and so we would expect the ruddy turnstone and the Caspian tern to be much more different than the ruddy turnstone and the red knot, or the ruddy turnstone and the black turnstone. Simply because once this split occurs, then little mutations pop up in the DNA, and the longer these two organisms are apart, the more mutations pop up as a result of the passage of time. And so DNA evidence is another piece of evidence that seems to indicate that evolution is the result of the biodiversity that we see today. A final piece of evidence that we want to mention is the distribution of organisms that we find on Earth. And so, interestingly, the distribution of organisms seems to indicate a common ancestor because of in a scenario that can basically be summed up by Darwin's observations in the Galapagos Islands. And so we see situations in which organisms have the opportunity to spread out into new areas, and we see new species arise as a result of the colonization of those new areas. But what we also see is that if we look at different continents, we see a pretty distinct division in species from one continent to another that seems to indicate that the common ancestors were restricted to these continents, at least after a certain point in evolutionary history. Furthermore, we see that continents that have been separated from the other continents for a longer period of time, Australia is actually the example here, have species that are much more different than species we find on continents that were together for a later period of time. And so let me try to re-explain that briefly. At one point, the current hypothesis is that all continents were together, and then the continents split apart to form the continents that we're familiar with today. Australia appears to have split off first, based on geological evidence. That geological evidence is consistent with the biological evidence that we see in terms of the organisms that are found in Australia. If we look at the reptiles and the fish and the birds that are found in Australia, we find a group of organisms that are completely different than what we see in Europe, North America, and South America, and so forth. Now, the organisms found in Europe, North America, South America, and the other continents, Africa, and others, are different, but they are more similar to one another than any of them are to the organisms we find in Australia. And so, interestingly, the distribution of organisms that we find on the face of the Earth seems to indicate that, or at least most scientists conclude, that the distribution of organisms we find on Earth seems to indicate that the biodiversity we see today is a result of evolution. Finally, the last bit of evidence we want to look at is the fossil record. And so the fossil record is an interesting aspect of evidence, and you don't have to go too far from where we are here in central Kentucky to find a fossil. If you walk out on any of the hills here around Wilmore, then you'll find rocks laying in those fields, and in most of those rocks you will find fossils. At least a very high percentage of those rocks you will find fossils. And so it's not these fossils necessarily that you find there that have been helpful in allowing us to put together fossil evidence that seems to support evolution, but there are fossils that are found worldwide, and different fossils are found in different locations. And when we collectively look at that fossil evidence, although we're not suggesting it's 100% complete, does seem to support this idea that organisms transition from one species to another. In some cases, we have organisms in which all of the parts are present, all the different stages are present. Horses are an example, and so if we look at the fossil record that we have concerning horses, we see that we had a horse ancestor 55 million years ago, if we accept carbon dating, that was very small, well adapted for living in dense forest, as would have been present on Earth at that time. And then as we move towards the present, up until 4 million years ago, then we see that this horse ancestor transitioned into a larger and larger form that went from having paws to having hooves, and this was consistent with the change in the environment available to this organism. It went from a situation in which dense forest jungles were the habitat that was available to a situation where there were these large open areas, savannas, open fields in which the horses could graze. And so it was very advantageous to be tall and to be fast if you lived in those areas that were open. So you could see predators a long way away and simply outrun them. So certainly the fossil record is not complete, but there are a number of very interesting fossils, and they could be interpreted in different ways. It's important for us to view, as we look at things from a scientific perspective, it's important for us to view things with a very cautious and a very thoughtful approach. Perhaps you would say a skeptical approach to think about it and to examine the evidence very carefully. But most scientists are comfortable with interpreting the fossil record in a manner that describes the transition of one species to another as we look at the history of the world. I want to conclude this little part of our chapter with a quote and a very brief discussion here on evolution from a Christian viewpoint. Evolution can be troubling for Christians, and it's somewhat controversial in Christian circles in some scenarios. And what I want to do is just to provide you with one perspective, not at all suggesting it needs to be your perspective, but one perspective from a Christian who's a very prominent scientist today. And so on the screen we have Francis Collins. Francis Collins is currently head of the National Institutes of Health. He was appointed head of the NIH in 2009 by President Obama. Collins is somewhat of a surprising appointment, given that Collins is a conservative, and Collins is a Bible-believing evangelical Christian. And so the NIH, if you're unfamiliar with it, is the biggest funder of scientific research in the world. And so few people would argue that Collins is one of, if not the most influential scientist on the face of the earth today. The NIH makes determinations regarding which research is going to be funded and which research is not going to be funded, and they dole out millions upon millions of dollars every year in the funding of research. And so Collins is a very successful and influential scientist. He played, you are familiar with him as well, because he was mentioned in the context of the Human Genome Project. He was in charge of the government-funded portion of the Human Genome Project. And so this is what he says regarding evolution and his Christian faith. And so the first bullet, in the first bullet, he says that the evidence supporting the idea that all living things are descended from a common ancestor is truly overwhelming. And so when he uses the word evidence there, what he's referring to are the bullet points that we just looked at over the past few slides. And so this evidence, when looked at by scientists, most scientists, not all, as I pointed out, but most scientists can come to the conclusion that yes, the Earth is fairly old, and it appears that all living things are descended from a common ancestor. And so Collins is very open about this and says that he would not necessarily wish that to be the case. as a result of the fact that he's a Bible-believing Christian, but that doesn't change the fact that the evidence is there. And so it doesn't serve the faith. He says, and so I'll just read his quote, "It does not serve the faith well to try to deny that evidence is present. The evidence is out there." But he says that he has no difficulty putting that together with what he believes as a Christian, because he believes that God has a plan to create creatures with whom he could have fellowship, and he believes that God could have used evolution as a mechanism to achieve that goal. So I'm not in any way suggesting that this needs to be your viewpoint or your approach, but I do encourage you, as you formulate your own opinions and your own views of the world, especially as it, of course, pertains to the topic at hand, that you take into account the evidence that's there, and somehow, regardless of how you come to process that, incorporate that into your worldview, as would be appropriate for a Christian to do. And I also strongly encourage you not to consider the possibility, at least, that is not held by all Christians, that evolution and Christianity are not necessarily diametrically opposed. And so there are many scientists who have no trouble incorporating evolution and a Christian viewpoint. So I encourage you to consider these things as you come to your own views on the topic.